Wait for the live button. Yes. Go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to A Mighty Blaze. I am Jenna Blum, one of the co-founders of The Blaze. And today for our Friday Frontliner, I am thrilled to say hello to our special guest, Rachel Beanland, author of The House is on Fire, which I have to do these jazz hands every time I say your title. So awesome.
It's a good title, right?
Right. Welcome, Rachel. Thank you for joining us on The Blaze.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is fun.
We are delighted to have you. And before I get into Rachel's bio, a quick note for The Blaze. For those of you who are repeat Blazers, welcome back. Thank you for bringing your party to our Friday afternoon. For those of you who are new here, Blaze is a team of 35 creative professional volunteers dedicated to linking writers and their readers since the age of COVID, which I can now say like it's in the rear view. And even though the world has opened back up and writers are back on the road, they, like, for instance, our guest today is in a residency, we're also still online. And so we're connecting you with your favorite authors in your living rooms where you don't even have to put on pants. And if you like us here, please give us a like or a follow on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, which I refuse to call the other name, on LinkedIn, on Goodreads, wherever. We are ubiquitous. Hello, Renee from Southeast Florida, but it's warmer there than in Boston. And please consider signing up for our newsletter, which is www.mightyblaze.com. So you never have literary FOMO ever again. No more FOMO. Nobody likes that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest, Rachel, reading her official bio. Rachel, you ready for your bio?
I'm ready.
Okay, buckle up. It's you. Many of you probably know Rachel from her debut novel, Florence Adler Swims Forever, which was selected as a BNN Book Club pick, an Amazon featured debut, an Indie Next pick, and one of the best books of 2020 by USA Today. It was also named, this is so amazing, it's such a great lineup for a debut. My debut had none of these things. It was named a New York Times Editor's Choice and was recognized with the 2020 National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction. Congratulations on those accolades.
Thank you.
The House is on Fire. Everybody at home should also be doing these jazz hands whenever we say this title. Is an Indie Next pick, a GMA Buzz pick by Good Morning America, a Washington Post most anticipated book. Obviously, it proved out on that anticipation, and one of the New Yorker best books of 2023. Rachel's essays have appeared in LitHub, Business Insider, Creative Nonfiction, and Broad Street, among others. Rachel, welcome to The Blaze again. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you for having me. That was lovely.
Do you have this feeling whenever anybody reads your bio, like, who are they talking about?
Yeah, no, I'm still like, I published my first novel at 39. I worked in PR for 15 years. I dreamed of writing a book, and so to be, to listen to an intro that includes not just one novel I wrote, but two is absolutely surreal. So thank you for doing that for me.
Oh my gosh, you're welcome. Thank you for doing it for yourself. You earned all these accolades. Actually, what does that feel like all the accolades? Does it feel like a mighty dream, or does it?
Yeah, it does. It feels like a dream. I mean, like, none of this stuff matters, of course, like at the end of the day, because you still have to go back to your laptop and work on the next project. And it feels like you're learning to ride a bike every single time. So, but it's fun. Yeah.
I have this great t-shirt that says being a writer is like riding a bike, except the bike is on fire and you're in hell. It's like one of my favorite. I mean, I know we're not digging ditches, but there are those days where you're just like, okay, my bike is definitely on fire today, and yet I'm just going to keep going. That's it. I'm at a residency right now at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and I'm working on, my new project. And it's like, I sat and looked at a Word document today, just like I would have done 10 years ago, like, whew, what comes next? So that part never changes. No, it doesn't. And I'm totally going off the reservation with all of these questions, but I feel as though being a writer is such a strange and uneasy mix of egotism and humility, like every day, like the sort of like grand ego to think, oh, people are going to be interested in these characters and what I have to say, and these imaginary people who are in my head. Like, that takes a grand belief in oneself. And yet when you sit down in the pants on fire, like, to write every day, some days it goes great, and most days it's just kind of like, wah, wah. Agree, disagree.
No, it's totally, it is the weirdest career that way. Like, it's so strange, but I mean, I'm happy to be doing it. So
Same, likewise. Okay, so please tell us about, and because Rachel's at the VCCA, she does not have her book, so I'm going to
I
hold
know
it up
I'm
a
I
lot.
hold it right here, but I don't have it.
She is holding up her invisible House is on Fire. I will hold it up a lot.
Yeah.
Love,
Thank you.
like
Appreciate it. Isn't it a pretty cover?
it is. It's so perfect for Blaze. Also, thank you so much for writing a book called The House is on Fire because it's so on brand for us.
Mhm.
Also,
Mhm.
so fun to read, although I probably should not say fun about like a disaster novel, but I love disaster. So could you please tell us what this book is about for people who
Yeah, so the novel is based on the true story of the 1811 Richmond Theater fire, which is this kind of little known disaster now. Very few people, kind of at least nationally, have ever heard of the Richmond Theater fire. But at the time it occurred in 1811, it was the largest kind of urban calamity to ever befall the United States. Our country was 35 years old. Um, Richmond was actually like a pretty big city. I mean, it was 10,000 people, which by that standard was pretty big. It was already the capital of Virginia. Virginia was much more like the center of things, because, of course, the United States was only like the eastern seaboard. And when this happened, the fire killed 72 people, including Virginia's governor. It affected both, the white and Black community in Richmond. It affected people further afield than just Richmond. It affected, Richmond was such kind of a hot spot, especially during the winter season, that people had come from all over, the kind of more rural parts of Virginia, up north, for the season. And so, there were just a lot of people who were really devastated by this, even if they didn't lose their lives.
And where did you get the genesis for this book? Like, where did the idea come
It was kind of a crazy origin story in that, I had moved to Richmond in 2007, and I was so thrilled to be there. But within like 2 hours of showing up in the city, I hadn't even really, like, our moving truck had not even arrived. I was flying in to interview for a job. My husband had already accepted a job, and a realtor came and picked me up at the airport and was like driving me around, showing me neighborhoods. And he showed me the Fan, which is one historic neighborhood in Richmond. And then we were driving down Broad Street towards Church Hill, which is another very historic neighborhood in the city. And he just kind of randomly points out the window at this church, monumental church. And he says there used to be a theater there, and, kind of explains just in very broad brushstrokes what had happened. He knew that there had been this fire in the middle of a performance, that, all of these people had died. I think he knew the governor had died, and he knew that the victims had been buried on the site of the theater. And so this church had been erected as a monument to those who had perished in the fire. And I was 26 years old at that point, a very long way from writing a novel, though I would have been absolutely thrilled if someone had pulled me over and told me that that was going to be the outcome. And I just remember thinking, wow, like, that's an incredible story. Like, I would love to read that novel. Fast forward 13 years, the pandemic hits. Florence Adler Swims Forever, my first novel, I had finished it, I had sold it, but it was not out yet. It wasn't coming out until July 2020, which, nothing like debuting a novel in the middle of a pandemic. And so I was sitting there kind of working on something else that was going to require a lot of travel. And of course, when March 2020 rolled around and we all went in our houses, I kind of very quickly realized that this might be a slightly unrealistic project to be biting off in the middle of a pandemic. And I started to wonder whether there was a book that I could write that would be set closer to home. And so those two things, kind of like being physically in Richmond in 2020 and having to think about, like, how could I, from a practical standpoint, like, write something that doesn't require jaunting off somewhere, led me back to the Richmond Theater fire. And I'm really lucky because the Library of Virginia, the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, all of these kind of wonderful historical, entities in Richmond stayed open during the pandemic. They have incredible archives about the fire. There was also the woman who wrote the nonfiction book about the fire, Meredith Honey Baker, lived in town, and we masked up and met, at an outdoor cafe, one day, like into 2021, like once we were feeling a little more confident. And, she gave me some of her materials. Like, it was just like, it was the book I was meant to write during this one particular time. And, so all of my angst about the pandemic went into this book.
What better time to write a book about a disaster than in the middle
And in the middle of a disaster. Yeah, it worked out.
Yeah, it's kind of like when people watch horror movies when things are going really horribly in their lives, because you think, well, at least I'm not being chased by a man who has saw fingers. I mean,
right.
What a fascinating origin story. I love this. So the story stayed with you for a long time.
Yeah, it really did. And, the funny thing is, when I give talks in Richmond, I will frequently ask people, how many of you knew about the fire before you heard about this novel? And I would say it's like never more than like 30-40% of people. Like, it's not, despite the fact that it was a humongous event in Richmond in 1811, and really a humongous event nationally in 1811, it, 200 years, it just like didn't have the staying power for whatever reason. And so there still are a ton of people who don't know about it. And so that's been a really fun part. I mean, to the extent that anything is fun when you're writing about a horrible disaster like this, it has been really interesting to see people discover this fire all over again, because there were some really heroic stories to come out of the fire and some just really inspiring stories.
I want to ask about that as well, but I also want to ask just about what you said about the local, is it Richmonders?
Yeah. I think Richmonders works. Yeah.
Richmonders. I was going to ask what the local reaction was and whether people had a sort of proprietary feeling about this particular incident, like this awful incident. And I wonder if it's because like the War of Northern Aggression was fought after this fire that it sort of subsumed the fire in popular.
Yeah, I think that is, I mean, from a very practical standpoint, a lot of archives were burned during the Civil War, right? So like buildings burned, their materials burned inside those buildings, like, so a lot of the storytelling that we would want to do about, a place like Richmond pre-Civil War is harder to do because there's just less material. Of course, like in popular culture, the Civil War also just became such a huge thing that it's honestly kind of hard to find books set in Virginia that are, historical fiction that are not about the Civil War. I mean, that was something I very intentionally was looking for, right? Books that kind of lead up to that. And you get a lot that's set kind of during the colonial period. And then everything just like gets quiet for a while. And it's like there's, kind of like 80, 100 years that it's like, oh, nothing happened. And it's like, no, of course, that's not true. But we kind of pay attention to these two extremes, founding of the country almost falls apart. And actually there was a ton of stuff that happened in the middle. And the Richmond Theater fire was really kind of fascinating because not only was it this tragic event, but it also really led to or contributed to the Second Great Awakening. So, you have all these people that are just partying hard in Richmond and elsewhere, right? And then all these people die and they think, oh my God, God has smited us. Like, we need to pull it together. We need to build some churches. We need to just like get our butts back in the pews. And so it really did kind of become this interesting turning point too.
Yeah, I loved reading about the society that surrounded the fire. I think what you've done here is like this excellent use of or demonstration of like what in my novel workshop we call the Titanic formula, which like I talked about with my friend Julie Gerstenblatt, whose book Daughters of Nantucket came out around the same time of yours and was about the Great Fire of Nantucket. I
read it. Yeah.
I figure you guys know about each other.
Together.
Yeah, big word. So in class, we were always saying, like, are you ready to go back to Nantucket? Because there was this very compelling thing about creating a cast of characters or resurrecting, in your case, a cast of characters and letting your reader get to know them as people, and then all of a sudden having them face this cataclysm. Like there's something unlookawayable about that. And so, of course, as soon as the fire starts to consume the pages, I was like, oh my God, I'm pinned in my chair and I can't move from my chair. But if I hadn't cared about the people first, I really wouldn't have cared as much about the fire. So,
Right. Yeah. So like Julie and I had fun when we were talking about our 2 books, and, you know, they're both these like fire books. And so the JCC in Atlanta got smart and put us on the same panel. And we were talking about the fact that, you know, in her case, she kind of presents the characters and then builds up to the fire, right? In my case, I give you a little tiny snippet on each character, and then you're in the fire, and we're in the fire for about, I don't know, 75 pages. And then it's like the aftermath of the fire. And I think in my case, in both my books so far, book number 3, which I'm working on now, is a different formula, but my first 2 books were both these kind of aftermath stories, right? Like something bad happens, and then everyone's got to unwind it and figure out not just what went wrong, like that's not really it, but just like, how do you move forward, you know? And I think for me, a lot of that, I think I will keep cycling back to that my entire career, this idea of like a great tragedy and how you move forward. Just my own father died young, and I'm so interested in how families and how communities grieve and come together and then kind of like move on, you know, and kind of carry these people with them and these experiences. And so, yeah, it is a formula that works. I mean, Titanic, it's a little bit different, right? We all know the Titanic's gonna go down. And so we spend a lot of time, like in the movie, right? We spend a lot of time getting ready for that moment. So all the anticipation is in knowing it's coming. I don't know, but I could sit here and talk novel structure all day. I mean,
I will happily do that. And I should say too, when I talk about the Titanic formula, like that is a movie that I'm incapable of not watching. Like whenever I see
I know.
in any interview, and I'm like, well, I thought I was going to sleep tonight, but apparently I'm going to sit here and watch the show again.
Watch 4 hours. I tried to get my kids to sit down and watch it recently, and they were like, no. Sorry, Mom. No, you don't understand. I went to the theater 3 times to see this movie. Like,
okay.
You know,
I will tell you, and everybody watching, that first of all, my brother and sister-in-law and I are so into it that we recite all of the lines in tandem with the movie. And my brother has a character he calls Street Rat Jack, who is like who Jack actually would have been, who's like stealing, you know, stuff from everybody on the ship. Right. But we were so obsessed with it. We went to a Titanic exhibit in Florida recently, walked through the whole exhibit, reciting all the lines, annoying all the museum guards who were like, yeah, everybody does this.
Yeah, I'm sure. They've never heard it before.
Right. And I'm just like, would you like to go to a real party? And they're like, no. And there are those menus from what people were actually eating on the ship, from 3rd class, 2nd class, 1st class. And I became obsessed with the menus. And I'm going to have a Titanic dinner party in my apartment on April 14th this year with those menus, probably from 3rd class. But you should come up here because it's going to be smart and cool. Yeah, come up. Yeah.
Oh my God, I want to. That sounds so fun.
Yeah, anybody watching, if you want to come to a real party, you can come up to my Titanic dinner party on April 14th. It's a Sunday. You can do it. Anyway, this is how obsessed I get with historical recreation and historical fiction. I feel like there's a kind of a magic in spending your time in an alternate era and having it feel true. Like when you were writing The House is on Fire, when was the first moment that it started to feel like you were living it? Do you know what I mean? Maybe that's just me. Don't leave me hanging out here.
No. Like, I mean, I definitely got to a point where a lot of the research was easier, where, you know, in the beginning, you know, you're kind of like stopping every 2 minutes because you're like, oh, what's the thing they drank out of? What's the thing they put on their heads? Like, what's the thing that they slipped on their feet? Like, you know, just even basic stuff. You just don't know, like, what was the style of dress that they were wearing, or, you know. And then you reach a point where you know that stuff and it gets much easier. Like you can kind of move through the world a little more blindly almost, right? And I see why writers can finish a book and want to stay in the same time period, because they realize like, oh, I already built that world. Like, I'm good. I just need to stay there where I know what everything's called, you know?
There is that familiarity with it. Like I am a World War II girl usually, and I was trying to get away from that in a recent book, and I went back into it. And so I spend all my evenings now watching Ken Burn documentaries, Ken Burns about the war, because I'm so fun that way. But there is a weird sense of being at home in that era, and I can't really figure out why it is. I was having this conversation with our thoughtful bro, Mark Cecil, who you just met in the green room and was watching. Hey, bro. And we were talking about writer DNA. And there's something in my DNA that plugs me into that time period as an expression of writing about trauma and aftermath, which is also what I write about. And if I like analyze my origins, I'm like, oh, that's probably why, but there's still an element of uncertainty about it, which is why.
And you know what's interesting? I think like my whole origin story or whatever you want to DNA, my writer DNA, is that I grew up as a Navy kid and we moved around constantly. And I never lived in one place for more than 2 or 3 years. I always was the kid who had to like walk into a new room, knowing no one, introduce myself to everyone, figure out how to get invited to the birthday party, whatever it was, you know? And I think it made me like a really good observer of people. But as I write novels, I find that I finish one and I'm like, okay, time to move on. Like now I want to go to a different time period in a different place. And I have all these settings in my head that I'm walking around with because I lived in so many places, you know, that it's almost like I'll never run out of them. But it does mean that every time I sit down to write a novel, I have to start at the very beginning, which is, you know, it's just a lot of research.
Why? Why do you have to start at the beginning?
Because I like, even if it's a place I've lived before, I have to like completely start from scratch on researching it. Like I go so deep and I read so much stuff and I interview people, like, you know, I just like do all the things to try to figure out like, okay, what was it like? What were people doing? Obviously I couldn't interview people in 1811, but you know, it was really important. Like when I wrote my first book, Florence Adler Swims Forever, it was set in Atlantic City, which was where my mother's family was from, kind of Jewish Atlantic City. And it was based on a family story that had occurred in our family. And it was like one of my crazy goals was that I wanted, you know, any older person. I mean, the story was set almost 90 years in the past, but I wanted any older person who was reading this book to read it and say, I got everything right. You know, like that. And I got an email once that was from a guy who was turning 100. He was literally 99. And he had known my grandparents. He'd been in school with my grandparents. He had even met my great grandfather who died in probably 38 or 39 when my grandfather was 16. And he wrote me to tell me you didn't miss anything. And I just was like, oh, thank you. Like this, you know, that kind of thing just keeps me going. My editor, it drives my editor crazy because it's like, you know, she's like, you don't need all this research, like cut. But I don't know. So yeah, I do feel like I'm often starting over.
What a great honor to know that you got everything right. Like what a great accolade that was.
Yeah.
I think
it was better than anything else I had heard about the book the whole time.
Totally. Because from somebody who was there to say like, yes, you recreated this so beautifully is really, I feel like that's important. Hey, Michelle. Oh my gosh, Michelle is a blazer.
Hi, Michelle.
In a while. Hello. Hi. I love Florence Adler Swims Forever. I will say, I want to ask you about Florence Adler also, and I want to talk more about The House is on Fire, but I will say that for me, recreating the setting and getting into the world and doing all that research, I know many writers who are like more Mad Libs writers than I am, who will write the emotional story and just kind of leave blanks where the research goes, like insert radio broadcast here or insert what they're wearing there. And I can't. Like I tried with the book that I'm working on now. I'm like, just sit down, bang it out, do the guerrilla writing. Like, you know what this plot is for the scene, like get the characters to hit their emotional beats. And I literally was incapable of it, like to the point that yesterday was December 7th, the day of infamy with Pearl Harbor. And I was sitting there listening to like FDR broadcasts about it and so on. And I texted one of my friends and said, "Happy Day of Infamy." And she's like, "Do you mean Hanukkah?" And I was like, "No, it's Pearl Harbor Day." So I'm like really in it, like I'm in it. And for me, that's part of the joy of writing and writing
Yeah.
historical fiction in particular, is it's so transporting. And so I feel like it's my job 1,000% to get all the details
Yeah.
right. So the readers are also transported, whether they are 100 years old or not, like they, kind of live there.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So before we return to The House is on Fire, can you tell audience members who have not yet had the pleasure of reading Florence Adler, can you give us your Reader's Digest pitch about that?
Yeah. So, when my grandmother was a little girl, she grew up in Atlantic City, and when she was like 6 or 7 years old, her aunt Florence Lowenthal, who is I think 19 or 20 at the time. I always get it confused now, which I changed the year by 1 year in my book. She was training to swim the English Channel, and she went out for a swim in open water in Atlantic City, and she drowned. It was July of 1929. And one of my grandmother's earliest memories was her body being brought back up onto the beach, that day in July. And that particular summer, my great grandmother, my grandmother's mother, was in the hospital on bed rest. She was pregnant. She had lost a baby the previous summer, and the family wanted to make sure that she did not lose another one. It was considered a high risk pregnancy. And so the family, and it was really spearheaded, the decision was spearheaded by this would be my like great great grandmother, decided that they would not tell her sister had died. And they kept the secret for, as long as it took. I don't want to give too much away. But I always knew growing up that, my great great grandmother had walked into this hospital room to visit her daughter and had acted like everything was fine, when the reality was that she had just buried, her other daughter. And I was always just completely mesmerized by that story. My mother would tell it to me a lot. The women in my family universally believed that my great great grandmother had made the right decision in keeping this secret. And so they would often tell it as kind of like putting my great great grandmother up on a pedestal, like, isn't she incredible? She did this thing. And, I just, as a young person and, teenager, young adult, I always was like, I don't know, guys. Like, I just don't know, like, was that the right thing? Because I feel like, if I had been, in the position of my great grandmother in the hospital, I might have wanted to know that my sister had died. And so when I got really serious about writing, my first novel in my, kind of mid-30s, they always say, like, your first novel is the story you've been carrying around your whole life. Well, I had been carrying that story around forever, and I'd always been fascinated by it. And I'd always also seen the ways that the story influenced like later generations of our family. Even 90 years later, there was still all this stuff we didn't tell my grandparents, stuff my siblings wouldn't tell my mother, like, because we had this example for so long. So I fictionalized the story. It's set in 1934 and follows this Jewish family in Atlantic City over the course of one summer as they are keeping this secret. So again, an aftermath story. The drowning happens very early, and then it's everything that happens over the course of the summer.
That is so fascinating. The sort of celebration of and culture of secrecy that gets built around like the heroism of manufacturing and keeping that secret. Has that shifted over generations in your family? If I can ask such a person.
Yeah. Well, so I think actually writing the book was really helpful because, for my siblings and I, we would kind of say like, okay, maybe we stop some of this. Like maybe we kind of like hold my mom a little accountable and say like, we used to do stuff like I'd go on vacation and be like, hey mom, if anyone dies while I'm on vacation, could you go ahead and call, that kind of, just like it had gone off the rails,
You're like, just text me at least if somebody, pops off the mortal coil. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it has definitely, changed. But even my mom, I mean, I can remember when I was writing Florence Adler since forever, I would talk to her and say, like, "Oh, mom, it's going really well." Like I was writing part of it in a workshop. And so I was getting feedback from people, and the feedback was generally really positive. And my mom was just so confused. She was like, "I don't understand how you're going to write a novel about this." And I was like, "Well, there's all this ambiguity, like a lot of gray areas, whatever." And she was like, "I don't get it. What gray areas?" Like she just.
That's so fascinating. The sort of the blind spot. What was her reaction to the book when it came out? Did she
Oh,
like
she was thrilled. Like, it was her family story. And to see, like, her mother had died by the time the book came out. And, here she is, like, in this book as a little girl. And, of course I fictionalized tons, but it's kind of a fun thing. Yeah.
Yeah, to have your family immortalized in that way because
Yeah. And it kind of keeps Florence Lowenthal's memory alive too. And, in a way that we wouldn't still be talking about her. So it's been nice.
also a great honor, I would say. Okay, let's go back to The House is on Fire. Are you ready to go back to The House
Yes,
is
I'm
on
ready.
Fire? Okay, good. So you developed quite a gallery of characters in
Mhm.
this book, and they each get points of view. And I have so many writer wonk questions about that. Like, did you write one person's story all the way through and then like shuffle them all together? Did you write it chronologically? But I would love for you also to introduce to your readers, who are these people? Like,
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about the people that we meet who are involved in the fire and surviving the aftermath.
Yeah. So, for me, um, I wanted to cut down my characters a little bit. In Florence Adler, I had like 7 points of view. I went with 4 for The House is on Fire. That was a gift I gave myself, um, which was still a lot. But because the fire had affected the whole community, and because that community was both white and black, and there were actors, and there were people in the audience, there were all these different kind of people that were affected by this disaster. I wanted to represent that whole community in the way I told the story. And so, there were incredible, because the fire is really well documented, as a historical event. There are a lot of stories that arose naturally, out of everything that we know about the fire. For instance, there was a young stagehand that was referenced in the inquest report. Like they did an inquest to see what the cause of the fire had been. And this young stagehand, I wanted someone who had a view into what had happened backstage, especially because, you learn that that the troupe did try to blame the fire on a slave revolt. And so I knew I needed, a view into what was actually happening backstage, and what this troupe was trying to get away with. And that young stagehand who still has, some shot at being a moral human being, was someone that I really wanted to follow.
Mhm.
The box seats up in the theater, the second and third floor boxes, were the hardest seats to get out of. And they were also where the wealthiest ticket holders were sitting. And so I knew I wanted someone up there. There was a lot of historical evidence that supported the fact that the women had not been well cared for as everyone was trying to escape the building, if I'm to put that gently.
Mm.
And so I knew I wanted a woman up in those boxes who kind of could witness some of the depravity of the people around her. And so Sally Henry Campbell is the daughter of Patrick Henry. She was at the theater that night. And I think it's, at least somewhat safe to assume that she was maybe in the boxes, given, her stature. She was a 31-year-old widow at that time. And so I kind of kept those biographical details, and wrote her into the story. There was an enslaved blacksmith named Gilbert Hunt, who we know ran to the theater the night of the fire. He was not at the theater that evening, but he was visiting his wife, who was owned by another family, and that family, their daughter was in the theater. And so they kind of panicked. They heard the theater was on fire, and they sent Gilbert off to go look for this young girl. And while he was at the theater that night, he saved over a dozen white women. So his story became fascinating to me, not just because of what he did that night, but also, I was so curious to know if he got his due, right? There were a lot of people in Richmond who owed him a great debt. And then the last person I followed was a woman named Cecily Patterson, who's based on a real woman named Nancy Patterson. And Nancy Patterson, there were 6 black Black and multiracial victims of the fire. And they're listed, in all of the early lists that are put out, after the blaze. They're listed, of course, separately than the white victims, because this is Richmond in 1811. And next to two of those victims, there are really surprising notations next to their names. So one man has the word missing next to his name, and then Nancy has the phrase supposed to have perished. And so historians have long kind of questioned that, because they've said, well, if you're dead, you're dead. Like, why would you need extra notations next to your name? And the thought is that at least in 1811, when whoever was like compiling this list was doing this job, there must have been some thought that some of the Black and multiracial victims had maybe used the fire as an opportunity to escape slavery. The second floor gallery where free and enslaved Blacks could sit had its own entrance, which, of course, is not something that we condone, but in this particular case was somewhat helpful. So those were the four characters that I followed, and I followed them for about 3 days after the fire. And there's a lot happening.
There is a lot. It's like a kaleidoscope of action. Yeah. After a very prolonged action sequence, which takes serious chops. I'm really interested in so many things about what you just said. First of all, I think attempting that many and carrying it off with great, bravado isn't even the right word, but great expertise is the word that I'm looking for. All of those points of view is so difficult. I will do maybe 3 points of view in a book, and that's a lot. And then I do 1 point of view, and that also still seems like a lot. It's just a lot. How do you go about developing or recreating those people? And did you have a favorite? And I'm asking too many questions at once. Interview or fail, but
no.
The ghost of any of these people while you were writing, did you ever feel them sort of come alive and kind of tap you on the shoulder and be like, hey, this is the way it actually went down?
I definitely developed strong suspicions about what I thought had happened, because that was, the interesting thing about, you've got the historical record, which gives you some facts, but obviously the historical record is also written by white men. For everything right after the fire is written by white men. You get the accounts of white women 80, 90, 100 years later, when their diaries and letters start showing up in genealogical societies. And of course, you often never get the accounts of people of color. So there was a lot of kind of feeling between the lines. I don't know that anyone's ghost was tapping me on the shoulder, but I would kind of use my powers of deductive reasoning, and then, what I know about other historical events and what I know about other cultures and, time periods, whatever, to try and kind of figure out, okay, what do I think logically happened? So that was one thing. As for, writing the 4 points of view, I often would come downstairs from my office and vent to my husband, because this is, of course, during the pandemic when I could vent to no one but my husband, who had to listen to all my angst about the fire, about this project. I'd say, I feel like I'm writing 4 novellas. And it really, because one of the rules I had set for myself, this is unlike Florence Adler, I was writing all these different points of view, but they were all part of the same family. Mm-hmm. So, people would kind of come in and out of each other's chapters, and you'd see the same person again and again, even if you weren't in their head. But with The House is on Fire, because I was writing people of different races and different classes, I always wanted to stay true to what their lived experiences would have been like in 1811. And so I was never going to have a white woman and an enslaved man, get together and say now we're going to go fight the baddies. Right. And so that meant writing very separate stories, very separate accounts, and then only weaving them in when it made absolute sense to do so. Which did just require a lot more work for me, because it was really 4 separate settings. It was, 4 separate families, 4 separate, all the background characters, the secondary characters were also, for the most part, different. Though they sometimes do intertwine. I don't know if I answered all the questions, but
yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. But yet I have more questions. And
yeah, I love answering them. So
good. And I know we have some audience questions as well. And I wanted to ask our producer, Karen, to pop one up in a minute. But first I wanted to say, wait, what was my question? I wanted to comment about the difficulty of recreating, I think, the Black experience too, at a time when a lot of the slaves, and I was so struck by the fact I don't usually read narratives about Civil War days when people are not free, right? So I was
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, we're still in slavery times here. This is not Jim Crow. This is like actual slavery. So of course the slaves couldn't
Yeah.
read, or many of them couldn't read and write, and therefore like entire perspectives are lost to time. So how do you recreate those, and was that a daunting task?
Yeah. I mean, I don't, I don't see how I could have written this book and not been daunted. But I was also really committed to writing the perspectives of both white and Black residents of Richmond, because the fire had affected everybody. So, for me, the story, could not have been told from just the perspective of white residents. That would have felt really, really wrong. So as for kind of how I approached it, I did a ton of research, of course, and just tried to like enter the entire experience with a lot of humility. I was really committed to trying to read as much as I could by writers, not just in that time period, but also, present day historical fiction writers, but particularly writers of color who were writing about slavery. And one of the things that I knew I had like ahead of me as a real challenge was that not only did I have to convey like, okay, here's slavery, right? But and get that right. But I also had to explain to readers in the best way I knew how, without being heavy-handed, that slavery in 1811 looked a lot different than slavery did in 1860. And we're so programmed, because we read so much that's set in the Civil War time period, to think we know what slavery looks like, right? And the reality was that in the 1800s, from really the beginning of the 1800s on, white people in the South were kind of constantly tightening their grip, because they were getting more and more nervous. Like, you've got this rebellion that I mentioned a couple of times in the book, Gabriel's Rebellion, which occurs, right at the beginning of the 19th century, where you have an enslaved man named Gabriel Prosser who can read and write. And as a result of being able to read and write, he can organize a rebellion. And he writes to people all over the South and other enslaved individuals and says, hey, we're going to all meet up in Richmond, and, on this night at this time, and here's what we're going to do. And, come join us. And the rebellion ended up being squashed before it could really get going. But they believe over 1,000 people were involved in the rebellion. And at the end of the day, 25 men were hanged for it. And so, after Gabriel's Rebellion, you get the owners of enslaved people saying, oh, reading, that might be a bad idea, right? And so there were all these different kind of policies that get like pulled back or tightened as the years go on. For instance, when I was writing Gilbert Hunt's character, he could work, he could hire himself out and earn extra money that could be used to potentially buy his own freedom, right? But in another 20 years, that won't be possible, right? Or 25 years or something. Yeah. So anyway, things were kind of constantly changing.
That's really fascinating. And guys, if you want a more in-depth look at what it was like in 1811, you have to buy and read the book, which it teaches you a lot by osmosis, as good historical fiction does. I'm going to ask, I hope it's not too sensitive a question, but I'm a great way to lead into a question too. You're like, well, our time's up. Going into the tunnel. But as a white writer working in an era of increased cultural sensitivity, was it scary to write? I mean, you can't not write about Black characters because there are Black people in the fire. Like, you can't ignore those perspectives, but it's nerving in our current climate to write about Black characters and feel like you can only do your research and do the best you can.
Yeah. I mean, it is nerve-wracking. And of course, like, I wanted to be extremely careful. But so I have a multi-ethnic family, and I have children, who are Black and multiracial and Hispanic, and we're all over the map. Everyone's all over the map. And I had the kind of opposite experience when I wrote Florence Adler Since Forever, because it was set in a Jewish family. I'm Jewish. Everyone in the book is Jewish, with the exception of like one person, and he's also white. And my daughter, who's Black, was, when the book came out, she was really into theater. And so we were, joking around about like whether the book would sell movie rights. Haha, wouldn't that be great? And she's like, oh, well, which character would I play, in Florence Adler? Like which character? And we had this whole discussion about the fact that there weren't Black characters in Florence Adler Since Forever. And, we talked, of course, about Jewish families and all this, but and that was something where, I sat there and I looked at her and I was like, Clementine, next time I write a book, I'll make sure there's a character that you could play in the movie. Mm-hmm. And, so I'm also kind of coming from it from that point of view where, I want to write literature that represents a lot of different viewpoints, because, that our literature informs the rest of our culture, right? We make our movies based on what books are out in the world. And we do everything kind of like the books are often the genesis of so much. So for me, it feels like the right way to go about it is to write a lot of diverse people and do the very, very best you can with it and see where that takes you.
Mm-hmm. I think the books are often like the way you get ideas into the cultural conversation, right? Like that's
right.
And it creates
an honor to be a writer and to be able to, influence that conversation.
Yes. And hopefully engenders empathy. Okay. So I have one last question. Then we're going to open up to like a lightning round of questions from the audience. I have kept you like pinned to that spot, and it's like almost an hour, which is astonishing to me. But did you get pushed back for this at all or no?
I really haven't. I mean, like, honestly, I've gotten a lot of wonderful feedback. And no, it's been a little bit of a love fest. I mean, with the exception of like one incident in Florida, but that did not have to do with how I wrote Black characters. It had to do with the fact that Black characters were in the book at all. So, yeah.
I'm sorry to laugh. I just think there is a sort of level of ridiculousness to that. And I know we had a question from one of our audience members about that in the chat. So
okay.
maybe we could like pop that up at some point. But Karen, would you like to pop up some questions for Rachel? Thank you for being so patient, you guys. Renee asks, Rachel, were you in contact with any of the families whose characters were based on real people?
So, most of the families at this point, if they're kind of like documented stories over 200 years, those stories have wound their way into like the nonfiction book that was written about the fire, and they're in the archives, or, there are little anecdotes. And I will say that, I didn't need to uncover all of them in order to write this book, but while I've been out on the road talking about the book, it's been really fascinating because I will have people come up to me and say, I am a descendant of someone who either died in the fire or was there. Because you have to remember, there were 600 people in the theater that night and 530 something made it out, right? So of those 530 people, they all went on and told their descendants, I survived the Richmond Theater fire, right? And they told their descendants who told their descendants. So, I had a man come up to me at a reading recently and say, I've always been told that I'm related to a descendant who, someone who was in the fire. And the only detail I have is that when he emerged from the building, he was white. He was covered in some sort of dust. And I said, that checks, because the stairs collapsed and there was plaster dust everywhere. And that makes total sense. And so, I mean, these stories exist and they kind of persist. And that's been kind of lovely. Yeah.
That's amazing. I love the connectivity, the surprise connectivity of writing in that way. Like the gentleman who wrote to you who was 100, who knew you're great.
Yeah, it is the most fun.
Yeah. That is a great gift. Okay, maybe have another question, please. Anissa, hi, Anissa. Anissa is like our favorite Blaze party girl.
Hello. Hi, Anissa.
What is your favorite part of the writing process? Editing, research, writing, maybe something else altogether, like stopping for the day and having a martini? Like,
Like a lot of writers, I dread actually writing. And then once I get going, I'm like, oh, I love this. This is good. Right. But like, I gotta have my mojo. And I create all these little rituals to get myself to write. Like, I have like a special hoodie I'll wear a lot, or like I always drink my coffee out of one mug, and I like sit in the same place, and I do all these things to try to like make the juices flow. I do always like editing. I find it like really like rewarding to take something that was like and then turn it into something great. And I also like the research process. So like I think all of this means that I'm in the right profession, I think.
Yeah, you just don't like the writing part.
Yeah.
You do.
Just the part where I'm staring at a blank page and it looks like an abyss. That's the part I really don't like.
Yeah, nobody likes that, Rachel. I
Mhm.
think one of the great privileges of talking to a lot of authors on Blaze is that there are so many differences among the way people write, and yet there are universalities as well. And you and I write a lot alike, I think.
Yeah.
I actually I hate sitting down and making a mess. Like I have to entice myself to do it with the special coffee and the special mug and the blah and the blah. Now I
Mhm.
have like a Zoom accountability room with other writers. I'm like, okay, I'm going to the Zoom room. And then I
Right.
sit down and I get into it. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I love
And
these
then it's fine.
people. It's like rationing magic in a way. But then
Mhm.
I also love editing. I like to clean up the mess that I have
Yeah.
made initially.
So rewarding.
And the research. Yeah, it's all good. Okay. Great question, Anissa. Thank you. Okay. Do we have another question? Maybe we have like time for two more. Audience questions. What surprised you the most about The House is on Fire? Great question about the writing of it.
Oh my God, there were so many things that surprised me. You know, I think one of the things that surprised me was the thing we were talking about with like the fact that slavery in 1811 didn't look like slavery that I thought I knew, right? Um, I also just was surprised by like a lot of the different rabbit holes I went down. And, I would discover these people in history that I had never spent 1 second thinking about. The editor of the Richmond Enquirer, who had a very long career running that newspaper. I read an entire dissertation on him. Like, oh my God, so much information about Thomas Ritchie I have in my head that I do not need. I read multiple books on William Wirt, who is a bit character in this story, but was someone that I was kind of really fascinated by. And there was this entire community. I think because I'm a writer, I'm always looking for like the stories of other writers. So there was this entire community of writers in Richmond, and there was even a woman involved. But you know, they were doing all the same stuff that we're doing now, right? They were meeting, they were publishing each other's work, they were trying to cheer each other on. They all wanted to kind of elevate the literary scene in Richmond. And this was at a time when like men aren't even writing novels and they think women are wasting their time reading them. And it was just like an interesting world to immerse myself in. So I think maybe that's one place where I was surprised to kind of discover this literary ethos that was happening then.
I love that. Yeah, the literary ethos is a great way to put it. And I think the weight of all the research that you carry in your head, even though it may seem like you'll never use it, and maybe you won't, except at certain cocktail parties where you're like, I have a lot of information about
It has
this.
to be a really specific cocktail party.
Yeah, that's really
Yeah.
party of editors, maybe, or something. But I do feel that readers can sense that weight. Like, to return to icebergs, and we were talking about Titanic at the beginning, that it's the tip of Hemingway's iceberg, I think, is all that the research you do gives the historical novel its gravitas and its
Yeah.
heft. So we know you did your research. Okay, one more question, please, Karen. The audience question is, oh, I love this. What writing advice would you give to your younger self?
Oh my gosh. I know it's not very in vogue now to say to write every day, but I do still like touching my project in some capacity every day. And it took me so my dad died when I was 29. And really what made me become a writer was that I wanted to write about him. And I spent several years so desperate to write about him that I would wake up every morning and write. And, I really wanted to write down all these stories. And I felt like I had a deadline because I was worried I was going to forget the stories, And so that kind of got me into this habit of writing every day and writing towards some sort of goal. And then by the time I had kind of reached the end of this little project I had created, I was just in this habit, and a habit is all you need, right? So I think that if I could kind of go back and tell even my like 21-year-old self, right? Like, you just have to do it every day or whatever works for you. I'm not, no dictating, but like whatever it is, just that regularity, that coming back to it over and over, and not talking yourself out of it, was, for me, that was really what changed things.
So hard to do, I think. And yet, what such an honor for your dad.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Like, and he really had always believed in my writing, and had, told me like way, way back. I was working on some stupid blog or whatever. And he was like, you should be writing novels. Like, what are you doing? And it took him dying for me to do that.
So what was his name?
Sam.
Sam. So I think my dad likewise. So they're sitting up there somewhere saying, like, look at those little pictures. We told them.
I know. I really do think. Yeah.
So lovely. Well, thank you. May his memory be a blessing. And thank you so much for joining us tonight to talk about The House is on Fire. Guys, if you don't already have your copies of this, you should buy at least 15 or 16 copies.
Yes, thank you.
Everybody for Hanukkah. Give it to people for Christmas. Give it to people in January when they need to be kept warm. It's a very hygge book. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to put in a little special plug at the end here, which I rarely do, but we're having our very last Authors Love Bookstores episode on Wednesday. It's the Kimber Joe Christmas show. So please join me at 4 on Wednesday to watch these amazing authors who have lifted up 155 other authors and bookstores since March 2020, which is a lot. And again, Rachel, thank you so, so much for being here with us tonight.
Oh my gosh. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Happy Hanukkah. Go light some candles and have some latkes.